Good morning, everybody. Happy Saturday. I'm happy to see so many folks energized in the chat, calling in from all over. My name is Somala Diby, and I am the speaker and program chair of the Black and Design Steering Committee for this year. And I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so happy that you all are joining us today. I'm here to introduce our first panel, which will kick off a long day of incredible events. So this panel is titled Everyday Portals to Black Cultural Pasts, Presents, and Futures. Everyday Black cultural artifacts and practices have the potential to transform design practices. This panel will bring together architects, artists, curators, and archivists who privilege quotidian expressions of Black heritage across the diaspora in their work. The panel aims to demonstrate how a deep study of everyday Black cultural and spatial practices can inform planning, architecture, and design. And so we have an incredible lineup of panelists for you all today. Our first person who will kind of open us up is our moderator, Dorothy Berry. So Dorothy Berry currently serves as the Digital Collections Program Manager at Harvard's Houghton Library. She graduated from Indiana University with an MA from the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology and an MLS from the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. In 2020, she was honored with Library Journal's Movers and Shakers Award and the Society of American Archivists' Mark A. Green Emerging Leader Award. Her work has focused on the intersections of information science and African American history, ranging from newspaper database research on the earliest mentions of African American concert music performances to inventory design for the cosmetic kit of Hollywood's first Black woman makeup artist, to exhibit curation highlighting transatlantic art inspired by African American film. Archival materials open the door to history in visceral and unfettered ways. She is committed to a career of expanding access to those materials through creative and innovative ways, focusing on digital and physical methodologies that unite stakeholder communities with their often displaced heritages. So without further ado, I will not postpone the panel. I want to let you all kind of get to the discussion. So I will pass it on to Dorothy, and I hope you all enjoy.
Thanks. Could I have my slides up, please? So I wanted to first start with a good morning for everyone, and also to bring up this phrase that is used oftentimes in my profession, actually existing archives. We talk a lot across disciplines about archives, meaning many different things, meaning memory in physical form, meaning memory in ephemeral form. And then there's also the labor that people like me do in these actually existing archives, physical spaces that have labor issues, that have, too cold offices, that are actual places where we go every day. Thinking of African American archives and the everyday objects that make up our lives, I started this slide deck introduction to myself with this quote and this photo. This photo was going to be a reminder to me and an introduction to you of the material heritage that Black people carry with themselves. From Cambridge, Massachusetts, I was calling back to this photo from 1872. I did not know at the time that I made this slide deck that I would actually be on the land where that house was pictured, in a house that was built 4 years later after this burnt down. As you can see in the tiniest figures in the front of that photo, that is Caroline Boone Barry and William Barry, my great-great-great-grandparents, who got this land post-emancipation and built the house that I'm currently sitting in. The objects in this house, the objects that are in any of our homes, whether they're that old, whether they're more recent, hold memory, and we give meaning to that memory that is individual and also shared within our communities. The memory of things that we have, but also the memory of all the things we don't have. As I said, I'm in a rare situation being in a house that my great-great-great-grandparents built in 1872. So much of Black memory and Black cultural heritage is in fact passed down through the knowledge of what's left behind. And then there's also the preservation of what's physically left behind. And that's where these archives come in. When I think about archives and museums and these everyday objects, I love to bring up this June Jordan quote that came about in the 70s in New York when there were big debates about Black representation in museums. A famous poet said, "Take me into the museum and show me myself. Show me my people, show me soul America. If you cannot show me myself, if you cannot teach my people what they need to know, and they need to know the truth, and they need to know that nothing is more important than human life, then why shouldn't I attack the temples of America and blow them up?" And that's a lot of what we are potentially going to be talking about in terms of design practice and creative thinking that pulls in Black existence and memory and the everyday, blowing up the temples of American importance. The objects that make up everyday life are as invaluable as they are common. But when time and industry and class and race displace that commonality, the values can shift. So as an archivist, the idea of what is rare and what is distinctive, that value has been long established by transfer of ownership. You know, what is important? Well, the thing that's important is the thing that cost a lot of money to make. And the thing that cost a lot of money to make was purchased by someone who had a lot of money to get it. But that is not necessarily how we have internal value systems. And it's also not necessarily how, in combat with our internal value systems as Black people, we now come against museums and archives that want to purchase our everyday because time and industry and class and race have displaced that rarity. So I'm going to be moderating this discussion with these fantastic thinkers and creators around everyday objects and how we can think about our Black existence and Black materiality and Black archives in different ways. I'm really glad to be here with them today.
Thank you, Dorothy, for that beautiful presentation. I'll try to build on some of the themes you laid out, and maybe we can get the slides up. So continuing on some of the provocations that Dorothy presented, I would say that my work, both in my design practice and my teaching, builds with the global constellation of Afro-diasporic spaces as living archives. And a lot of my interest in the ordinary, the everyday, comes from the belief that these spaces, for example, compound houses on the continent of Africa, provide intimate portals that help us understand how ancestral knowledge and sensibility is transferred across generations. I would argue that the Black compound is really a space that produces expansive definitions of kinship. In a lot of ways, it is a fluid territory that dissolves the enclosure, and it cultivates various forms of communality with neighbors, friends, and relatives. And at least in the context of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where I grew up, it's typically a lush environment for various rituals and ephemeral spatial practices. I've seen compounds host weddings, religious holidays, extended coffee ceremonies and meals with loved ones. And it really gains its ambiance through a slow and deliberate cultivation of fellowship. Lately, we've been thinking a lot about the compound house, especially as the population continues to grow. In my lifetime, the population of Ethiopia has almost doubled. So as that continues to happen and as the city continues to densify, we've been really trying to experiment with ways of multiplying the compound house vertically, conceptualizing the wall as a form of vertical tapestry, and also as a kind of thickened zone that extends the rituals that have always been around, especially in this context for centuries. And these are really spaces that refuse the essentialization of Africanness as the rural or the quote unquote informal or the underdeveloped, because I think these are spaces that really allow for a critical and projective engagement with the past. And this is a project that is currently under construction in Akis. But I would also say everyday portals to Black culture also have non-static registers. They are social and spatial practices that remain unsettled. And these ordinary environments seem to almost effortlessly redefine the street or the building. And these are spaces that remain somewhat incomplete and unbound, offering various forms of togethering and mutual aid that work against the myopic vision of, let's say, urban designers or architects. These are also spaces that refuse the tyranny of permanence or more specifically, architecture's pretensions of timelessness. Instead, they are framed with fluctuating material temporalities, but also negotiable zones of uncertainty. And these are spaces that produce, a kind of inherent resistance to the regime of property, or anything that attempts to commodify and contain the Black quotidian. Our interest in urban marketplaces in East Africa / the Horn of Africa really comes from the fact that they are continuously under construction. So they are really becoming spaces where we are, in a way, as Africans, as Black people, redesigning ourselves. So I think that's also a key aspect to this, because a lot of the discourse around urbanization on the African continent is comparing it to what might be happening in the West. But when we begin to look at these spaces in their own terms, then we begin to identify specific modes of self-fashioning that are taking place. But I would also say that the density of relationships generated from these spaces automatically creates an environment of care and stewardship. Basically, your neighbor's issues become your issues, and moves away from some of the kind of technological escalation and alienation that we're beginning to experience here in the West. Moving to the American context, when we started working on the Reconstructions exhibition curated by Mabel Wilson and and Sean at MoMA, we were really mostly thinking about the metrics that are typically used to measure and speak about Black life, and how they are always insufficient. And the installation that we produced really became a prototype, a question that we can continue to return to. And that question was really trying to consider how we can invent a particular language to think about the immeasurability of Black life, but also Black spatial practices that remain illegible to the value systems of architecture and urban design. And I would say they remain illegible primarily because they are not strictly tethered to power and capital. And as we started doing research for this project, we also wanted to zoom out and think about the planetary scale. And we started thinking about the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, obviously as a space for an incalculable loss of Black life, but also a space that prefigures a global Black aesthetic. And I would say an aesthetic that can never be limited or enclosed by the nation state, and kind of generates this aesthetic that atomizes and echoes the continent throughout the world. This is a detail of the tapestry we produced for the show. Again, thinking about ongoing forced migration of Black people and the various forms of surveillance and precarity imposed by racial capital. So I guess the fundamental question when it comes to these everyday spaces for me is, how does one register, draw, or make images of the immeasurability of Black life? But also aspects of the Black quotidian that have strategically managed to remain invisible to the registers and value systems of settler colonial aesthetics. So we did a lot of work just by kind of meditating on everyday spaces within predominantly Black neighborhoods in Atlanta, and just trying to think about the actual material conditions and how a series of ephemeral events performed by people continue to redefine those spaces and give them new meaning. And this is a detail of the model that we produced. Again, fragments of these everyday spaces made with magnetite, a magnetic black sand found on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So I think we can go into it with more detail in the conversation. But that's what I have for you guys today. Thank you.
So I just want to thank the BID organizing committee. It's great to be back at Black in Design. And also thank you, Dorothy and Emmanuel, for these really great nuggets to think on and speculate on. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm going to share 2 activities or practices that connect our topic, everyday portals, to Black past, presents, and futures. So the Fabricating Networks quilt was one piece of a work commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art for the show Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. The quilt idea was a way to start making sense of all the research that I was finding on Pittsburgh. For the exhibition, the curators, Mabel Wilson, Sean Anderson, and Ariel Dion Krosnick had asked us to really focus in on a city, and I selected Pittsburgh. And the quilt was not intended to be the architecture of the project, but became a method of questioning. This quilt, made as a computational textile, points towards those experiences and skills with sewing, working with soft materials, and brings them into architecture. It's a method and operates as real material, as metaphor, and heuristic device for thinking about operations and concepts in making architecture. So for us in the studio, the gaps in between the images, the order of the images, the gaps in between the panels allowed us to understand what was going on in the photos and what this meant to us. Sewing these panels down to close our circuits, because the piece is a piece that speaks actually, signaled another phase of this quilt. We're intrigued and still intrigued with how the ordering of this quilt can remake new stories. One of my graduate students, Farzana Akhazian, played with this problem of scrambling the parts in another project to close the circuit on our quilt, which she calls the circuit game. The quilt was really meant to live outside of MoMA's gallery and seed a conversation with people about making, and is a repository of history. When touched, the copper in each panel activates a speaker that tells a story of what happened in the panel. We'd like to take this quilt on the road to the Hill District, which the pictures represent, and continue to hear and make new stories with the residents on the Hill. We'd like to have the residents add their own stories and photos. And for us, this is a way of getting outside the gallery to emotionally connect and be networking material. This idea was interrupted by COVID, but we plan to take this on the road next year as part of another project called the Unmonuments. The softness in this material system is how we define the concept of construction in our architecture, which is collaborative and incrementally built. The lily pad, which you see in this picture, the little round piece, was designed by Leah Beakley, a designer and computer scientist at University of New Mexico, permits the fashioning of do-it-yourself work. This is supported by a network of online tutorials and programs. And this network is also what we consider to be and understand to be the material. For many of the works we do, the ability to access and use these inexpensive do-it-yourself components is the difference between connecting with people or not. This panel of the quilt shows a scene that speaks to how I set up my lab, Soft Lab at Penn State. The lab is a way of foregrounding and making the experiences that many of us had as kids and still have working with soft materials. These materials call for another way of fabrication and thinking about architecture that connects both to the scale of the body, because we often start by making things like clothing and then can think our way and move up to very large scales of architecture. Working this way also returns you to the specifics of your body, not some abstract body that you are building for, but a particular body. This defines the two research directions in the lab that can be considered as part of a scalar continuum of design. A scene like you see in this quilt panel was a very familiar scene to me growing up, and I felt that many of the things that I'd been thinking about came from this well of knowledge about soft materials. And the second activity that I'd like to share with you is Black hair practice and the project Hair Salon, translating Black hair practices for architecture using computational methods. My collaborators are Cheryl Tucker Vasquez, William D. Williams, and Marcela De Signore at NYIT. The Hair Salon research project draws upon rich Black hair culture to imagine liberatory possibilities for the future. Situated between the natural and the cultural, Black hair and care practices occupy potent spaces that are source material for new ways of shaping architectures that resonate with Black identity. This project, which we've just started, will develop Black hair care designs such as braiding, locking, and crocheting to make new architectural structures and surfaces. And this research is situated between the culturally inspired work of these celebrated Zimbabwe artists, Nonsikelelo Mutiti and architect Joy Matashi. The hair salon research will, one, attempt to expand a conversation about Blackness and technological tools in architecture. Two, try to answer for how computational tools can translate African American and Black hair care techniques into descriptive algorithms that can be applied to the creation of new architectural material embedded in cultural practice and meaning. Three, demonstrate how these novel materials can be used in shaping architectural space. And four, expand the discussion of Blackness as an intellectual and aesthetic force in architecture. As you've seen from some of the pictures that I've just shown, there are other artists working in the space, including Sonia Clark and her Haircraft project. Sonia Clark recently was on exhibition. Her work was on exhibition at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., and she has recently published a book. The specific piece on the left-hand slide is part of the permanent collection at the MFA in Boston. There are other artists who are also working with natural hair care, so I am very much looking forward to a larger conversation to see how our work as architects also intersects with these efforts. We've also been inspired by Ron Eglash and Audrey Bennett's work with the Cornrow Curves program from the Culturally Situated Design Tools research ongoing with the NSF. I would add our contribution here as well as a different space. What we want to do with our project is emphasize the salon and the hair salon and make a space of conversation and discussion. And we hope some of you will join us as we set up. There will be an invitation and call to join. And in closing, the conversation that we're hoping to cultivate is about Black culture, its relationship to technology, and concepts of translation and meaning making. We're interested in generative ideas about Black culture and its relationship to architectural design. And we hope the project offers space and time to dream new structures for Black life. And there I will close.
I'm super interested in both of those presentations and all of this work. And thinking of earlier conversations we had in preparation for this panel, I was thinking about this thing we discussed about Black lived experiences and the materiality around them or within them, and the labor that is making that legible, and how that can conflict with a practice of performing consumable Blackness. But then escalating on that, I was thinking, listening to both of these talks, we were talking about that earlier in context of non-Black people translating these experiences. But this also makes me think about intra-Black translation of Black experience, which is maybe more compelling in this context, or maybe more compelling in all contexts. But thinking of these things, the Black everyday, and acknowledging that we it's the design people and like academics, we like to put a "the" in front of things, but there isn't a "the Black everyday," because the Black everyday in Addis Ababa is different than the Black everyday in Appalachia. And yet there are also intersections, and yet maybe we all need to get our hair braided at some point. Yeah. I'm thinking of, especially recently, as I said, I am back in the Ozarks where my family has been from, but this is a region that had a mass Black exodus. So when I am here, the Black people that are here are from other places and came here. And so I don't look Black here, but I look Black in Appalachia, where the other Black people that have the same culture as the people from here are. So I think this sort of ideas of these translations and wanting to keep things, wanting to support the diasporic understandings of Blackness, but also translating every day is something I'm seeing across this work. And I wondered what thoughts are on this.
Felecia, you want to go first?
I was going to say, Emmanuel, you want to go first? It's a great question, and I'm churning on it right now. I'm thinking about it, but yeah, I think that a lot of when we talk about translating, you're talking about something that's always in motion and always crossing in between many different spaces. That it's not the something, it's this and that and the other thing and a little bit of this. And so I have found to speak of translation is also to think of it as a method that one is using in motion, and that one is considering trying to figure out where you are in motion at a certain time, and specifically like who you are. I think your example is great, Dorothy, where you're talking about how people understand you where you are in one place versus another place, and having that legibility appear or not appear based on your location where you have been. So that is something that we have been thinking about in our lab a lot, and I've been working with my students to think about how do you, I guess you'd say, help students think about how you understand yourself as something that's moving through, and that is, your space is changing all the time and you are changing all the time. So that it's a dialogue between where you are, and also your body is changing because of where you are, and that place is changing you. So it's a kind of interconnected feedback loop. So those are some things that we've been thinking about in my lab.
Mhm. Yeah, just to add to what Felecia is saying, I mean, lately I've been thinking a lot about the autobiographical example. And I think I read an interview recently with a few scholars in Black studies, kind of thinking about what it means to engage in different forms of autobiographical example, and how it's never a form of navel gazing. It's not really kind of self-obsessed, but it's really using a personal experience to speak about something that is relatable broadly. And I think that hyper specificity is the only way to even begin to engage with something that is somewhat universal. And for me, just reflecting on my own experience, you know, as someone who was born on the continent but moved to the US, and just continuing to at least understand the forces that created that movement, keeps me from venturing into the really loose definitions of quote unquote we, and really engage with hyper specific Blackness that in some ways helps us understand the overlaps, but also the differences. And I think, at least for me, you know, the shift from Addis to Atlanta was deeply, deeply formative because of the history of Atlanta itself, you know, as, I mean, still the Black Mecca, but also the community of African immigrants that live in Metro Atlanta, and how that experience and that community shaped my understanding of this country. So I think we have to find ways to keep establishing a set of links between the continent and wherever we choose to reside. Because I think if we get married to some of these deeply problematic ideas of the nation state, then it starts to create certain fractures that make it difficult to fight against, you know, the regimes that we're all trying to survive.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually want to add on to something you were saying, Emmanuel. Just coming from, you know, also a lot of the work we do connects with the scientific community. And when one writes a paper, for example, for a scientific journal, you erase every bit of yourself out of that. And you do not use the pronoun I. Yeah. You use the pronoun, you know, this was done. As a matter of fact, often what happens is you get a paper back and it's been edited to say, please remove we, please remove I, please remove any reference. And so the paper ends up being passive, descriptive. So I think that, you know, in terms of these things that are really shaping the way one reshapes the world that one lives in, are quite pervasive, and go to the literally the quotidian. Can I use the pronoun I? Because if I can use the pronoun I, then maybe I can avoid making a facial recognition system that does not recognize Black faces, because I can say that I was this Black woman and I made this, and so it might not work the same for you, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
so anyhow, I was just thinking about the hyper specificity as potentially being, in fact, more useful to universality than the kind of erasure of the subject.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, this is making me think of two things. One, thinking of Atlanta specifically. Someone else I know, a rural non-Southern rural Black person told me that their first time in Atlanta, they felt like they showed up at somewhere wearing a team jersey, but not realizing they had that jersey on. And so everyone was looking at them like, oh, we're on the same team. We all love this thing. And he thought,
Yeah.
oh, I was wearing this shirt. I don't know. And I tried to challenge that or escalate it and say, well, just because you found out you accidentally were wearing that shirt doesn't mean you might not like that team or could learn about it and still be in conversation. But also you can take it off other times. You know, she has a
Absolutely.
very
Yeah.
awkward metaphor about school team jerseys. But even beyond that, and thinking of the sports and not sports, but thinking of the scientific writing, and even beyond the real strictures of like technological writing and that formality, in and not as someone who works in architecture or design, but in academia writ large, and especially coming in museums and archives in this moment. And I see in the comments some museum archives colleagues, but this idea of, even on the more thinking of themselves humanistically, when we talk about Black people, the idea is suddenly working with community, which is then in conflict to a thing that we were doing before, which is not community. So all Black people are a community, and historical white or Western knowledge, which includes Black people, is non-community. And I feel like I have said a lot of times recently that I don't do community archives work because I'm working with 19th century pamphlets, and I talk to Black people who are members of communities, and I share with them and learn from them. But it's not the same thing. And that's actually a really big struggle for non-Black people I've been working with. The idea that Black people have everydays and have shared knowledges. And I almost think this relates to that sort of fear of the connection between Black people who maybe outside doesn't see that there's a commonality. The fear of a sense of kinship across the Atlantic and across community borders. The idea that even though, someone is not Ethiopian, to continue to use examples from this from this conversation, is not, but maybe knows some things about Ethiopian culture that they've interacted with, or specific cultures in Ethiopia that they've interacted with. And then I feel like the response in academia I get for that specific for me is, oh, so are you Ethiopian? And then I laugh because I think no one has ever asked that. No.
Yeah.
No. But that's sort of the idea of the only way you know these secret things. And that is, I think, maybe a point thinking of the design in museums and archives as predominantly white spaces, or at least white controlled spaces, even if you were looking at staff of museums and maybe the actual majority of them are not white, but the power people with money often are. And sort of that fear that we would all have, that there's shared knowledges that they don't have access to, or that is not in conversation, and how that maybe works to separate things out. And thinking of the everyday, that brings back this sort of idea that I wanted to talk about from my vantage as an archivist, because they had me moderate. So thinking of the archive and archives as this way of conceptualizing a physical model for memory, and calling on the imaginary to sort of fill in those missing evidentiary objects, which are often missing in Black contexts because of reasons of marginalization, oppression, and war, etc. And how you use this history and imagination in your creative processes that are also very future-oriented. Question mark.
I'll just give a brief response. I mean, I think it was great to discuss with you, Dorothy, and our kind of planning meeting, where you were just talking about how disciplined you had to be as an archivist when you engage with this work, and the precision that is required. And I think for those of us who are operating in the realm of art or design, a lot of it is based on the discoveries that come from misinterpretation and maybe even misuse of the archive. So I just thought that relationship was so powerful, because someone like you is really making sure that, the knowledge and the history is preserved with as much precision as possible. And we are finding ways to read it differently, or we're finding ways to imagine a different type of world using that material as the ingredient. So I think for me, and I mentioned this a little bit in the presentation, you know, when we started doing the research on Atlanta, it's like the moment you put architecture and Blackness together, all of the metrics you use basically speak about how Black life is devalued, right? If you look at property value, if you look at quality of schools, if you look at access to public amenities. So at some point after doing that for about 6 months, we just stopped and we said, okay, we need to find a completely different way of reading the city. And that way of reading the city cannot rely on the metrics that have been established by these disciplines of urban planning, urban design, and architecture, but really maybe based on the stories that people tell about their particular neighborhoods and the types of oral histories that basically just don't show up on the maps, you know. And that's when we started exploring this idea of immeasurability and how immeasurability is fluid enough as a concept that it allows us to be precise at moments to basically make sure that people who are from Atlanta, from these neighborhoods, can recognize them. But people who are not from there would basically assume that this is some sort of, I don't know, some sort of like collection of signs, let's say, you know. And I think there's a certain, not necessarily complete opacity, but playing with different levels of translucency that provide varying degrees of access for people who are knowledgeable and familiar with these environments. It's part of the ambition behind the work. And I think that definitely relies on the precision of an archivist, that relies on the precision of someone who is mapping these environments, who is finding ways to visualize them.
Yeah, if I
Felecia, you should jump in.
Yeah, I was just thinking that in terms of imagining or this idea of archive as physical model for memory, I would say just thinking back over the work that I've done over the years with various projects and different people, that model has been really flawed, and it's really hard to think that way, so that once one lets go of the archive as this physical model for memory, that then there are these gaps and cracks that are places for making things up, basically, and free play. And so I think that you know, this has emerged having done a few projects where you're looking for what happened to this person. Where did they go? Can we trace their family history? No, actually, their family tree is broken at this moment. We can't go any further back because the slave rolls don't show them anymore, so we can't trace anything. So you have to go into the imaginary, and I think there can be a precision in the imaginary. In artistic practice, there can be a really strict precision, but it's really listening closely to the precision that you have from the pieces that you found with that precise archivist. But then you understand, you listen very closely to understand what is the projected, what might be some of the projections that one might understand from this based on your experiences. And it has to be your experiences, right? It has to come from you. You have to be really honest about acknowledging that you are a Black woman looking at this person's life, or you're a Black woman looking to understand what happened to that piece of material or that house, etc. So acknowledging your intersectionality in that is critical to the imagination that happens afterwards. So I would say those are some thoughts on that. I'm sure I'll unfold some other ones as we go on, as we think about it. But yeah, great question.
Yeah, and it goes back to me to this sort of valuing of the hyperspecificity. You can have speculation and imagination on these historical figures, even if history is only 10 years ago, however old the historical figure is, when there's missing information. And the benefits of doing that come from that hyperspecificity of saying, here's how I, with my background as this and my identity as this, and my research on this, that, and the other, can envision a life for this person. And there is as much value to that. And I think this is something that is a challenge that this type of speculative, and I think speculative Black thinking is a benefit, and also a challenge that has to traditional humanistic ways of doing research, because it requires a humility. It requires you to say, this is how I'm interpreting this from this background, which is very educated maybe and has a lot of research behind it. But this is me, and this is what I'm thinking with the evidence. And that is both thinking of, scientifically with those sort of, it's very personal, and that's a turnoff for the scientific traditional community. And for the humanist community, you are not saying, you're not claiming it. You don't, that's not that sort of thought imperialist thing where you're like, I've made the discovery of who this person is with all this detail, and this is the only way we can see her. It's saying, this is how I'm seeing her with this background. Someone else could have another thing which is equally valid, and that is potentially more accepted in the arts, but depending on who's doing your guest crit, maybe not. And I do want to say also for everyone listening that we are definitely can do Q&A if you give us questions. We can also just talk the whole time, so it's really up to you.
Yeah, I think science is in the process of also reformulating itself. And we say science, it's just a giant word for a whole lot of different practices that happen with people asking different questions using different methods. So it isn't one giant, huge umbrella versus the arts. Everything is mixed together, actually. So I think that, there are also people who are asking questions about how things work, or asking, is this really the best way to ask the question? Maybe we should be more particular about that. So I think we'll see some interesting debates in the near future on that.
But also, I mean, I don't know, I'm sure this is something that you're thinking about, both Felecia and Dorothy, but I've been trying to understand the archive itself as something that needs to be redefined as well. Recently, I was going through this notebook, this record that my grandfather kept, almost of daily activities in the house. And it was such a powerful way to begin to understand my father, who I have a very particular relationship with. But reading that notebook gave me a completely different dimension, and a new way to kind of understand my family. So I think part of the work for us has to be about understanding there are Black archives that never made it to these universities, that never made it to these kind of vaults, and we need to develop strategies to actually read them and maybe hopefully build on them. I'm also thinking about these, ancient Bibles used in some of the churches in Ethiopia, and how they are living archives because people continue to use them daily. They're not in a glass box somewhere, and they're some of them are falling apart. The actual structures are also falling apart, but people are continuing to use them. So I just feel like there's a Western idea of freezing time that just becomes completely irrelevant in the rest of the world. I think some of the contexts that we're interested in are always building layers to what existed before, and not necessarily freezing that and continuing to meditate on, what happened at a particular moment in time.
Yeah, and that comes up quite often in archives, at least in archives rooms that I'm in, because the ways that these things are framed they're so easily complicated by one person coming in and knowing that this is still an everyday item. I think of actually a similar example at Houghton Library, where we have some Ethiopic manuscripts. And the Ethiopic manuscript was cataloged as Book of spells and devotions to, I think to Virgin Mary. And I was just asking questions because I thought that was interesting. And I said, well, looking at the cataloging, I was like, well, this is all Catholic words because that's how they catalogs everything. They have Ethiopian Book of Hours. And I was like, well, that's not a thing they have. That's a Catholic thing. They have different words. Why don't we use that word so Ethiopian people could find it? And that suddenly seems like now I'm being a provocateur, but in fact, the first time I said something like that, I was actually sort of more being simple than being it wasn't a provocation. It was just thinking, well, nobody uses that word. So if they were looking for that, they wouldn't find it. The only people that would find it would be people that aren't in the community, that aren't from, one of those Orthodox traditions they would use the words they know, unless you would translate yourself. And I've seen a similar thing. The British Library has a large collection of stolen Ethiopian manuscripts, and they are known stolen. Like there's a date, everybody knows it. And the curator of Ethiopian manuscripts was giving a presentation about them. And he took so much time to explain to everyone in this presentation that these are living texts. These are books people use. And it's sort of this weird thing where I don't know why you all stop using things, but we keep using the things. And they're alive things. It's not like a book. And it is beautiful, but it's functional beautiful. And that was my first time I saw an icon in a museum. I remember I didn't know if you were supposed to venerate it or not, because that's what you do with icons. Mm-hmm. But you don't when they're in a museum because it was stolen. And it's sort of this thing and that's, maybe those are older examples type thing, but thinking of even a grandfather's diary at places like the Beinecke and Houghton Library, there are discussions that are not always heard about the idea of, even if we can buy this, should it be here? And not just like the ethics of the neoliberal university, but just, I don't want your grandfather's diary at Houghton Library if your grandfather and you and your father have nothing to do with that library. And that is more contentious than one would think. And a lot of it has to do with this thing that is supposed to be positive, because the idea that now that they respect the idea that Black people have history, they need to consume more of it, so they have it. And the pushback is always, well, what about when Black researchers want to read it? And I think if we talked to Black researchers and told them that the family wanted to keep it, they would understand. And if not, those guys are jerks, even if they're Black, who cares? But it's, again, these things are more contentious than they should feel because of the ways that, as we're saying, we need to reinvent the value that's being placed on these things. Like having this item in a place is the biggest value. And the places that are the most famous place is the even better value. Even if you look at, the beautiful glass tower of books in the Beinecke and then think, oh, that's like way too many. Nobody can know all those books. Maybe the more power actually is having it at home. And the sort of ideas of the family value, maybe it's more important to me sitting in a house where I can see on the wall the deeds to this land from 1871, signed with big X's by my recently formerly enslaved ancestors who did not know how to write yet. I don't want that. I'm sure someone could do really good research on that. Great. That is a sort of a new type of power and positionality that those institutions aren't really designed for. And it's very confusing to them on a lot of levels, even thinking on the arts. I'm saying I apologize for the, what's that word? Taking so much space. But as I said, I'm at my parents' house and I was not expecting to be, so it's very strange. But from this town, the artist Joseph Yoakum is from here, this town of 1,500 people. And that doesn't get talked a lot because there's a self-taught artist who was discovered in Chicago. But then coming back to a place like this, I've gotten professors emailing saying, do you know where his family's things are? Because there's probably some of his art there that they maybe don't know or don't appreciate the value of because they don't know that he's now a well-known artist. And the answer is like, oh, I don't know anything for you. But that is a new type of thing. Oh, no, someone has a question. Can you please discuss what projects you are working on collaboratively, similar for the work you did for the Black Reconstruction Collective? Either one of you, go ahead.
Felecia, you want to
Okay, yeah,
jump
sure.
in?
Pretty much everything that we do in my lab is collaborative because that's basically how we function. So, you know, pieces that are scientifically based, usually everything that we do also crosses boundaries. It's neither scientific nor artistic alone, and that we are operating in both these worlds simultaneously. So I would say everything that we do is collaborative. There's nothing that I have gone off and just sat in the corner by myself, unless, you know, I have my own sketches, for example, that I bring to the group in my lab, and we talk things over, and they bring sketches and we talk things over. But in terms of the type of work that working in soft materials has framed, it has framed it in such a, I mean, it's basically work that requires one to connect with electrical engineers or artists who are working with programming and sensing bodies, or an architect or a person who's working with sensors. So to cross all of these places requires me and the people that work in my lab a kind of willingness to understand other languages and to be open to not understanding for a while. Like when you first start something, you're like, what did they say? Like, and they're asking, what did we say? And kind of basically coming to some agreement about what languages we're going to use for the project. So pretty much every project we have worked on requires this.
Yeah, similarly, I mean, I definitely don't do anything alone. Everything I make is in collaboration with a large group of people. Yeah, like the MoMA show is an example of that. It was a huge group of collaborators that we worked with to produce that work. But within the BRC, we're about to start a project that Felecia mentioned in her presentation called On Monuments, which is basically the 10 of us re-engaging with the 10 cities. And in addition to that, and this kind of ties to some of the discussions we've been having, I am working on a book project in collaboration with my colleague, art historian and curator Anita Bateman. And it's funny that Felecia mentioned Nancy because Nancy is designing the book. But the book is basically a series of conversations about positioning, both within our disciplines and in relation to the continent of Africa. So for the past 3 years, we've been interviewing artists both here in the US and on the continent. And we're putting all of that together into a book that will come out in the spring.
We have another question that's really great. I'm going to read it verbatim because it's well written. My question: in drawing from principles or rules and methods from archive or architecture and design or sciences, how can we help engage communities now in communicating those new measures, as Emmanuel says, for Black representation? Simply, do some kind of bounds need to be set to engage in the hyperspecificity, but still maintaining the fluidity that Felecia spoke to?
Yeah, great question. Do we need boundaries? Can you just read that part of the question again, Dorothy?
Yeah, it says, does some kind of bounds need to be set in order to engage in the hyperspecific, but still, how do we still maintain the fluidity that you spoke to?
Yeah, I definitely think so, that as one goes through, I mean, if I can speak to the projects that we work on in Soft Lab, as one goes through a project with other people that have no idea, like what you're talking about with textiles, for example, just to be really specific, you're basically helping them through developing a language. And so as they learn that language, the boundaries can change and you can move somewhere else. And the same thing is going on from their direction to you. So it's a conversation. And as you learn in that conversation, the boundaries both expand in some places and contract in others. So that in terms of fluidity, yeah, you do have to bound things, or else you just end up talking about the meaning of life and the whole world, right? It's just ridiculous. So, so you do bound it, but then as people understand more, the boundaries grow and change, and then you move somewhere else. And then other boundaries appear, right? So you're kind of discussing and figuring out what it is that you want to do. So I would say that's the fluidity that I'm talking about. It's both bounded, it's not totally free, but within making these kind of smaller pieces or boundaries or areas that you stay within for a particular time, then you can move forward. And that's how potentially I find that liberating. That's how you can get to doing really interesting and kind of things that maybe someone hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, I mean, I think, you know, your question was also addressing issues of the discipline, and when is it productive to be disciplined and when is it productive to be undisciplined. And I think, at least for me, it's productive to have a very tight frame when you start a research project of any sort. But in engagements with the people that you're collaborating with, or the context that you are analyzing, I think you have to be willing to risk the disciplinarity of the work. And that's when you need to be a little bit more fluid and willing to unlearn some of the biases that you might have inherited from your training, you know? So I think, yeah, like I'm engaged in a set of conversations through my discipline or my teaching on a daily basis. There are moments where I find it really productive to just zoom in and really talk about disciplinary issues. And then there are other moments where I feel like I need to challenge those boundaries. So I think, to me, it's really more about having a clear political project that hopefully will destabilize some of these assumptions. But outside of that, we need to be willing to improvise, you know, and enter into any one of those roles at any time.
Yeah, it just reminds me of something that my undergrad mentor, Roscoe Mitchell, who was in the Art Ensemble of Chicago, so big improvisational music, creative music person, would always say that you need to build up an improvisational vocabulary. And this sort of idea of, in that sonic world, the idea of having all of these different tools and things that then you can spontaneously compose a new thing. And that's sort of how I think of, I'd like to layer that on other types of work, of thinking, how do I have boundaries and also have that fluidity? Because sometimes those boundaries are needed for your own hyper-specificity. Sometimes they're needed for your actual work, just, you know, to be able to express it to other people, like Felecia was saying, so it's not just the world and everything. But this idea of having a vocabulary that you call on, and that could be vocabulary in the broadest sense of movement or sound or artifact, and then improvising within that world is something I have found useful when trying to show archival materials to people of varying different backgrounds who are going to have varying different responses, from the hyper scholarly to the hyper emotional, depending on the types of rare Black objects, because a lot of us have had things so stolen from us that even just seeing something that reminds us of a normal past, you know, just a child's educational award from 1870, that can make someone cry, because you've not thought about the idea that some children that were Black were going to school and doing great, and it wasn't because they were rich or whatever, it was just their life. And then we have one more question that says, can panelists talk more about examples you've seen of productive misuse of archives? I can start as an archives person. I'll say I don't really think that misuse is a word I would apply, because too productive. I will definitely apply misuse to things that are unproductive. But I think in terms of, I guess for me, what is important is thinking that if these archives and collections that are some sort of ostensibly public, like, you know, you can access them, that history should be thought of, at least intellectually, as being owned by all of its constituents. So that is to say, for me, I don't think that all, I don't know, WASP researchers have ownership of Black diaries that are in an archive necessarily. But I do think that you should feel an ownership of history because you are part of that. And so to me, whatever someone does, even if it is not a monograph evaluating bibliographic methodologies, is an effective use. And I think we can all think of beautiful art or something like that. You know, I, being very 19th century-ish, always loved Kara Walker's work with The Courier and Ives' War Between the States. And in my home, I have the original print of the Burning of the Colored Orphans Asylum from that set. And her work putting on top of that would have made that piece much more expensive for me to get. But this sort of idea of that's not a misuse, that is a use, and letting yourself own use. But misuse is only when you're being shady, I think.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Please.
Now you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think of Carrie Mae Weems's work, obviously. But when I say misuse, I'm kind of thinking definitely more from creative production standpoint, and how, you know, you can shift the meaning of something just by recontextualizing it. And I've also been, I mean, as controversial as this might be, I've been really thinking a lot about, well, I don't know if this is the space to bring this up, but Arthur Jafa's use of ex-slave Gordon's image. And I think it's a really, really difficult subject to even begin to discuss. But I think it brought up a set of conversations that just needed to be had within Black art amongst Black artists. So I think to a certain extent that's productive because it's injecting a certain level of criticality. It just even within Black art that I felt like was necessary.
I don't have any specific examples, but I do have some thoughts on this that potentially, you know, we may be misusing our archives now in terms of thinking about living archives, that in terms of Black culture, that it might be best off, as I think, Dorothy, you were making this point, out in society, out amongst people, being used, and potentially point to another direction that archives could be understood. In other words, the spaces that we find these in, if we want to think about it from an architectural point of view, the spaces that we might understand the archive might be a multitude, and that the public may have access to them in a different way than going to a single building and, you know, getting something out of the file cabinet or the precious drawer and then putting on the gloves, etc. So there might be technologically ways of, yes, doing the frozen archive, right? Archive is memory, but also having the potential to put these things back out so that people can use them in different ways and understand them as living things. So there's some thoughts that I had when we were talking about this idea of misuse. So perhaps the misuse is the other way around, so to speak. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really fantastic place to leave this beginning panel because we're at time. But I really want to thank everyone for participating in the conversation, both as listeners, as questioners, and as conversants. And I'll leave it at that.